All right, so good evening, everybody. Um, my topic tonight is Pope Francis and the Jewish community. And so I read within the last couple of days. I mean, certainly couldn't have been more than that, considering that it's topical. But there was an article in the Chicago Tribune by Rabbi Yechiel Pupko, who's somebody I know a little bit. He's an Orthodox rabbi who works for the Jewish Federation in Chicago. And he told a story that in 2013, before the conclave started that wound up electing Pope Francis. So Francis Cardinal George of Chicago asked Rabbi Pupko what the Jewish community would like to see in a new pope. And Rabbi Pupko said, somebody who knows us. And that's certainly what we got in Pope Francis. He of course was the Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires and the primate of Argentina, so the head of the Catholic Church in Argentina. Buenos Aires has a large and thriving Jewish community, and they had long considered Jorge Mario Bergoglio a friend. In particular, he had a close friendship with Rabbi Avraham Skorka. Rabbi Skorka is a conservative Masorti rabbi, and at the time he was the rector of the Seminario Rabbinico Latinoamericano. Okay, you don't have to know a lot of Spanish to know that, right? The Latin American Rabbinical Seminary, which is in Buenos Aires, is a conservative seminary, and Argentina is one of the few, maybe the only country where the major Jewish religious denomination is the conservative movement. And so Cardinal Bergoglio and Rabbi Skorka got to know each other. They had a TV show together, and they published a book together shortly before the Cardinal Bergoglio became the Pope. Very fortunate for Rabbi Skorka, I think, because it made the book, it was sold a lot more copies than it probably otherwise would have. Um, but shortly after Pope Francis was elected, he called Rabbi Skorka on his cell phone, and he says, it's Bergoglio. And he apologized that, I'm not going to be able to see you as frequently um, in the future. Um, but, aside from that sort of personal friendship, he had come to services at one of the larger synagogues in Buenos Aires on the first night of Hanukkah and lit the first candle. And there had been a interfaith Yom HaShoah service and concert in the main cathedral, well, the only cathedral of Buenos Aires, at which Cardinal Bergoglio spoke. And so I participated online. Yesterday, there was a panel discussion on the future of Catholic-Jewish relationships, and Rabbi Skorka was one of the panelists. And Rabbi Skorka said that, on that occasion, he spoke as a rabbi. Um, and I understood what Rabbi Skorka meant because Cardinal Bergoglio was a Jesuit, and I had, you know, those of you who know me, my mentor was a Jesuit Bible scholar. And I had invited him to speak at our wedding, and the rabbi who officiated, who ironically enough was from Argentina, wasn't really enthusiastic about him speaking during the service. So he said, let him speak after the service, you know, before the meal. And then when he heard what Father Walsh's talk, he said, if I'd known what he was going to say, I would have let him speak during the ceremony, because it was, you know, entirely based on obscure rabbinic texts that neither Rabbi Karpuch or I even knew, but Father Walsh knew. Um, so there is that, you know, that Jesuit thing. But anyway, so, you know, he was a good friend of the Jewish community in Argentina. Um, so that's to just lay out something quickly. But, you know, you can't, I mean, and again, those of you who know me, right, know that I'm always going to want to give you the larger historical background, because, you know, everything comes from somewhere, right? So there's been a revolution in Catholic Jewish relations essentially for the as long as my lifetime. It really started in the late, well, maybe longer than my lifetime, but it started in the late 50s, after the Shoah. Pope John the 23rd, who had actually been the Vatican ambassador in Turkey during World War II, and, you know, had seen Jews fleeing and so on and so forth. He sat down with a French Jewish historian called Jules Isaac, and Professor Isaac went through what we call the teaching of contempt, okay? How the Christian and particularly Catholic denigration of Jews and Judaism had, in many ways, paved the way towards the Shoah. And after their meeting, um, John the 23rd said to Professor Isaac, you have the right to expect quite a lot from us. And there were two sort of dramatic gestures that he made. One was, well, three, I guess. One was one Shabbat morning, he happened to be, you know, being driven past the main synagogue of Rome just as services were letting out. And he told the driver, stop. And he got out of the car and he greeted and mingled with the people who were coming out of services that morning. Another thing that he did, so the Good Friday liturgy used to have a prayer for the perfidious Jews, okay, pro perfides Judeos. And one Good Friday, he literally took a pen in the middle of services, took a pencil and crossed that out, said, we're not saying this anymore. Um, Another time he met with a group of American Jewish leaders at the Vatican. And when he walked into the room, he said, I am Joseph, thy brother. Um, which in a way I actually find problematic because it kind of reverses the story. But a Christian friend of mine pointed out that his given name was actually Giuseppe. It was Joseph, right? Joseph. So at any rate, but you know, the besides these sort of symbolic actions, he was the one who called the Second Vatican Council into being, even though it didn't finish until he was deceased and replaced by Pope Paul VI. Okay, so I'll talk about the Vatican Council in a little bit, but Pope Paul VI visited Israel in 1964, but it was not a state visit. He visited Jordan as well, and he entered West. I mean, 1964, East Jerusalem and the West Bank is still part of Jordan. He crossed over into Israel through the Mandelbaum Gate, which was the crossing point between Jordanian East Jerusalem and Israeli West Jerusalem. He did meet with the president, and he went to Nazareth. He didn't visit any Jewish holy sites. It was really a quick, not a state visit. But in 1965, so we're coming up now on the 60th anniversary of the adoption of the Second Vatican Council document called Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate means in our times, and it is the declaration on the church's relationship to non-Jewish religions, although far and away, the biggest chunk of Nostra Aetate deals with Judaism. And it rejects the deicide charge. Deicide means killing God. Ki'ilu as if, God could be killed, but the idea that the Jews killed Jesus and that Jews to this day bear guilt and responsibility for the death of Jesus. So Nostra Aetate rejects that and says that vis-a-vis the Jews, God does not repent of his gifts or his call, okay, which gets rid of what's known as replacement theology. Replacement theology means that, yes, God chose Israel, and then God sent us Jesus as the culmination of that. But because we rejected Jesus, God essentially, best way to describe it is God took the franchise away from us and gave it to the church, so that the church is the new Israel. And therefore, all of the promises in the Tanakh, which are promises that God makes to Israel, are now promises to the church and not to the Jewish people who, have our religion has no validity. And Nostra Aetate rejects that, says that, God does not repent of his gifts or his calling, acknowledges that the church grows out of Judaism. We have a common patrimony, and that we should have joint biblical and theological studies and fraternal dialogue. And if you read the document now, and as somebody who's like really grew up in a post-Vatican II, post-Nostra Aetate world, and I read Nostra Aetate now, it's weak. I mean, from the perspective of now, it's weak and even somewhat offensive. But it set in motion a chain of events which led to a tremendous amount of reconciliation. But there's always political consideration, right? So there is a department in the Vatican called the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, and it is part of the Secretariat for Christian Unity. And partly it's because they didn't want to piss off the Muslims too much, right? But they also, there is this sense that, and I agree, by the way, that we are intrinsically related, more than Jews and Muslims or Christians and Muslims, let alone Hindus or Buddhists, that there is an intrinsic relationship there. And so the Commission for Relations with the Jews sits inside the Secretariat for Christian Unity, and there's a parallel Jewish body. I just love the sound of this term. It's called IJKIK. Okay, what is IJKIK? The International Jewish Commission for Interreligious Consultation. Okay, and why does that exist? Is because at a certain point the Vatican said, look, we cannot meet with every Jewish organization in the world, each one of which thinks that it represents all the Jews. It's the same reason why is there a conference of presidents of major American Jewish organizations? Because President Eisenhower said, I am not meeting with every Jewish organization, right? You guys you figure it out and I'll meet, but I'm not having 57 different meetings. Okay, so Pope Paul VI really created IJKIK, and Dwight David Eisenhower really created the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. Okay, and now we get to John Paul II, who I think really did much, much more than his two previous. I'm not talking about John Paul I because he didn't have really enough time to do anything. But John Paul II visited the synagogue in Rome in 1986, a very dramatic and historic event, as people put it, at the time, that he was the first pope to visit a synagogue since St. Peter, who, the Catholics believe was the first pope. He One thing that, and this is something that like Jews would not even have been attuned to, but for Catholics it was very important. He convened an interreligious conference in Assisi, in Italy, which is where Saint Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscans, was from, and there was a platform at the front, and all of the religious leaders were sitting on the same platform. Okay, and this scandalized the Vatican bureaucrats. Why? Because the Pope was not at a higher level, like physically, at a higher level than everybody else. And by being like physically at the same level, it implied that they were equal. Which we might take for granted, but the Vatican bureaucrats did not at all, and they didn't like it one bit. But also, it was under John Paul II that the Vatican and the State of Israel established formal diplomatic relations. And so when the Pope, that was, I think, in 1998, when the Pope visited Israel in 2000, it was an official state visit. and he went to the Western Wall. He went to Yad Vashem. He visited the chief rabbis, and again, caused some small amount of scandal within the Curia because, um, they're negotiating. Actually, the guy who organized this visit on the Israeli end is a friend of mine. We actually, he and I, among others, were co-authors of a book about the Pope's visit to Israel. And, it was like everybody agreed that the Pope and the chief rabbis would have a visit, and the people from the Vatican assumed that the chief rabbis would go to the Vatican Curia in Jerusalem to visit with the Pope. But the Pope said, no, I will go and visit the chief rabbis in their office, which again, was not a gesture that previous popes would have made in terms of, recognition of the equality of the two religions, right? Now, so why did the Pope do these things? I think that, he was Polish and he lived through the Shoah. And, if we think that there's a fairly robust Jewish presence in the United States, we're 2 to 3% of the population. Before World War II, the Jews in Poland were 10% of the population. Okay, so that's, and the Pope, John Paul, he spoke about, the day that he went to school and all his Jewish classmates were gone. And his best friend as a child was Jewish. And then when he was the Pope, he actually provided an apartment in Rome in Vatican City for his best friend so that they could see each other. And it's also said that the shul in the town where he grew up had a really excellent Hazan, and young Karol Wojtyła loved music, and he would sometimes go to shul so that he could hear the Hazan, so that Jews were not strangers to him the way they were to the Italian popes, who had been reigning for several hundred years prior to that. As the Pope, he recognized the importance of the Shoah and the culpability of Catholics for the Shoah. Now, he did not say and would not have said that the church was guilty, okay? Because the church cannot sin. Members of the church can sin, right? So it's not the Catholic Church that was guilty, but Catholics were guilty, and he acknowledged that guilt. And on a theological level, he said, he was much more explicit than Nostra Aetate. He called Judaism the original covenant, never revoked by God and irrevocable. And he called Jews our elder brothers and our dearly beloved brothers. Okay. And, I don't always say this because it's like self-evident, but if you have questions or comments on anything that I've said so far, you don't have to raise your hand, just sort of jump in if anybody has a question about anything that I've said so far. Great. Okay, so we'll go on. So when John Paul II died, he was replaced by Benedict XVI, Cardinal Ratzinger, and it is generally considered that the church under Benedict took some steps backwards from the John Paul agenda. There had been a schism in the church, and there were like the Society of St. Pius X and other traditionalist groups in the church which had been excommunicated. Benedict let them back into the church, even though they held to, pre-Vatican II theologies. He allowed the Latin Mass to be said more often. You might say, what's the problem with that? Well, it's not just the language, it's also like the wording. And so it had stuff in there that the translated Mass did not. He actually restored that Good Friday prayer that John the 23rd had taken out, but then he took it out again after there was something of a backlash. But here's the thing. Benedict was by training a theologian. I mean, he had been a professor of theology most of his career, and he had a particular concern. Okay, so under John Paul, the church officially said the Jewish covenant is still valid. Jews serve God through Torah and mitzvot. We do not have a need or a desire to convert Jews to Christianity. Jews can achieve salvation as Jews by observing Judaism. Okay. Benedict did not really have a problem with that per se, but the church is now saying, yes, Judaism is salvific for Jews, and is at the same time saying nobody can be saved except through Jesus. Those two statements don't sit well together, right? And Benedict was concerned that people would say, well, if Jews can be saved through observing Judaism, what about Muslims? What about Buddhists? What about Hindus, right? And so, he tried to sort of soft pedal the Jewish stuff because really about his concerns about other religions, which is something that, may not have been really intelligible to Jews. I could say much more about this, but let's get on to Pope Francis. Okay. So Pope Francis was a return to, and in some ways, I think, an advancement beyond the John Paul agenda. Because I mentioned that as a child and a young man, Karol Wojtyła knew Jews, right? But as a priest and a bishop, he really did it because the Polish Jewish community had been, pretty much decimated. And post the collapse of the Soviet Union and other things. I mean, there's now something of a Jewish community in Poland, but there wasn't really when Wojtyła was active. So he knew Jews as a kid, but he never had contact with a living Jewish community as a priest and as a bishop. Um, Whereas Bergoglio did, right? He knew the Buenos Aires Jewish community. He had a close relationship, as I mentioned, with Rabbi Skorka, who was then the rector of the Seminario. They bonded over their shared love of what we would call soccer, they would call football, even though they were, and apparently Argentinians are like fanatics about soccer. But they cheered for different teams. Okay. Pope Francis cheered for San Lorenzo, and Rabbi Skorka is a fan of River Plate. But one of the hallmarks of Pope Francis's whole pontificate is what he called the culture of encounter. Okay, the culture of encounter. And when I read about what he means by the culture of encounter, and I'll share a good bit of that with you, as somebody who was Jesuit educated, because Pope Francis was a Jesuit. He was the first and so far only Jesuit to become Pope. And there are reasons for that. I mean, the Jesuits are really not supposed to, they're certainly not allowed to seek higher office in the church, and they're really not even supposed to accept it unless like the Pope sort of makes them. And actually so Bergoglio was known as the provincial of the in other words, he was the head of the Jesuits in Argentina as quite a young man. And then the Pope made him become a bishop, and then appointed him as a cardinal. But he had that wasn't like something that he intended. But anyway, so what is the culture of encounter? It's dialogue and it's listening. It emphasizes active listening and open dialogue, even with those who hold differing views. Challenging a culture of indifference by encouraging individuals to engage with and care for others, especially the marginalized. Building relationships, promoting the creation of meaningful relationships based on respect and genuine interaction. Seeing the other as a child of God, recognizing the inherent dignity of each person, regardless of their background or beliefs, as children of God, embracing diversity. Celebrating diversity and encourages finding unity amidst differences. And then it says, look, listen, stop, touch, speak. Look, listen, stop, touch, speak. Engage actively with others, not just passively observing or dismissing them. Practice dialogue. Be willing to enter into genuine conversation with others, seeking to understand their perspectives. Show compassion. Move beyond mere pity and allow compassion to motivate action and engagement. And finally, build bridges, not walls. Work to create connections and foster understanding rather than division and separation. Right. And so you could see somebody living by these principles and encouraging these principles, right, would have a very, very deep dialogue and a very deep appreciation and understanding for the Jewish community, right? And so when Rabbi Skorka says, you know, at the Yom HaShoah service, Cardinal Bergoglio spoke as a rabbi, right? You don't understand that because, I mean, what is the difference between, pity and compassion, right? Compassion, literally from the Latin, to feel with, right? In other words, to like imaginatively enter into, you know, how would I feel if I was this person, right? And so in a way, I mean, I think, and I'm not sure, I mean, English is Rabbi Skorka's fourth language, right? So I'm not sure that he meant really as a rabbi, maybe as if a rabbi, but you could see how by practicing this culture of dialogue that Bergoglio really could understand Jews and Judaism in a deep way. Okay. And in his autobiography, Pope Francis talks about the importance of welcoming immigrants in the context of his own childhood memories. Okay, and this is a longish quote. I want to repeat this. I want to shout it out. Please let us welcome our brothers and sisters when they knock at the door. Because if they are properly integrated, if they are supported and looked after, they can make a big contribution to our lives. Like those Polish immigrants I knew as a child who fled the war, today's migrants are just people looking for a better place who often find death instead. Too often, sadly, these brothers and sisters of ours who want a little peace encounter neither welcome nor solidarity, only an accusing finger. It is prejudice that corrupts the soul. It is wickedness that kills, and it is a dead end, a perversion. Let us not forget, for example, what happened to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And in their case, memories are plentiful. Right? Pope says he wants to shout that. So do I, right? I mean, so should all of us, right? But you can see, right, that his special concern for the marginalized and those at risk, right? And he understands that that's the Jewish experience, right? But it's not only the Jewish experience, right? But I mean, you could also see why, he had this conflict with our vice president, whether, to what I won't even go there, right? But you could see why, he felt a need to correct what he believed to be J.D. Vance's misreading and misunderstanding of Catholic teaching about this issue. Okay. And in 2014, he visited Yad Vashem, and this is what he said as part of his address there. Remember us in your mercy, talking to God. Remember us in your mercy. grant us the grace to be ashamed of what we men have done, to be ashamed of this massive idolatry of having destroyed our own flesh, which you formed from the earth, to which you gave life with your own breath of life. Never again, Lord, never again. Okay, and so like John Paul II and like Pope Benedict, he made a state visit to Israel. He prayed at the Western Wall, but he did another thing that neither of his two predecessors did, and that is he visited the grave of Theodore Herzl at Mount Herzl, which is the Arlington Cemetery of Israel. So he visited the grave of Theodore Herzl, right? Big deal. I mean, why is that significant? Right? I mean, who was Herzl, right? Herzl was the founder of the Zionist movement, right? And by visiting Herzl's grave, it was a recognition of the importance and necessity and justice of Zionism, right? In other words, it's one thing to visit ancient sites, right? And to say, well, of course, the Jews lived here 2,000 years ago, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if you're a Christian, you can't really deny that the Jews lived there 2,000 years ago because Jesus was a Jew, right? It's where he lived, right? But that doesn't necessarily, I mean, that recognition of the ancient connection of Jews to the land of Israel doesn't necessarily imply a recognition of the justice and necessity of Zionism. So visiting Herzl's grave was really, really, really important. Okay. But all right, so the panel discussion that I attended yesterday was introduced by Ambassador Tzion Evroni, who is a former Israeli ambassador to the Holy See, to the Vatican. And Evroni, in introducing the panel, said that prior to October 7th, we were living in the golden age of Jewish Catholic relations. But that subsequent to October 7th, not so much, right? And there is no question that Pope Francis said and did things that upset the Jewish community. He made certain statements. I mean, as recently as November, he said that the UN should investigate whether Israel is committing genocide. He didn't say Israel was committing genocide, but he said that should be investigated, right? So he didn't say Israel wasn't committing genocide either. In December a year ago, there was a nativity at the Vatican, which he visited, which laid the baby Jesus in a manger with a keffiyeh, right? And there is this whole thing of Palestinians and their supporters. Jesus was a Palestinian. Okay. there were no Palestinians, right? I mean, the term Palestine wasn't even used at the time of Jesus. It was Judea. The name Palestine was imposed on that land by the Romans after 70 CE, when they destroyed the temple and exiled the Jews to further separate the Jews from that land. Where does the word Palestine come? Comes from the Philistines, right? So, I mean, Jesus was Palestinian in the sense that he lived in the land that later came to be known as Palestine, right? But, I mean, look, before 1948, Jews who lived there were Palestinians, right? The newspaper that's called the Jerusalem Post was called the Palestine Post, right? If you want to, I see you, Dee, I'll get you in a second. There is an organization in New York that if you want to send money directly to a whole panoply of charities in Israel, you write a check to PEF. What is PEF? Palestine Endowment Fund, right? I mean, and the Jewish Agency for Israel was known as the Jewish Agency for Palestine. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much into the history of the term Palestine, right? But so this was anyway. The kafia was ultimately taken away. Yeah, Dee.
I remember growing up as a young child, my grandfather actually was an arms broker, an underground arms broker, to help send arms to Palestine. My grandmother was very active in, I guess it was the umbrella of Hadassah, I forget, Pioneer Women, whatever it was. But I remember every time I went into their home, this would be, I guess, 50s, because I was about 6, 7 years old. There was a little blue tin pushka, and we always had to put pennies in it. And it was always said to us that it was for Jews in Palestine.
Right.
Plus I also heard very frequently in some of my social studies classes that the term Palestine was a key term used by the Brits when there was that British mandate and all the issues were about I don't. Am I remembering
Right.
this correctly?
Yeah, it was called the British Mandate for Palestine. But
Right,
even
right,
so, if you see coins from that era from the British Mandate,
right.
it says in English Palestine, it says in Arabic Palestine, and in Hebrew it says Palestina Aleph Yud.
Okay.
What does the Aleph Yud stand for? Eretz Yisrael, right? Because it had two names. Okay, but so anyway, um, so here, so here's the right here. So what is the deal with um Pope Francis and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and why since October 7th a lot of Jews kind of soured on him. I mean, to the point where like right-wing Jews say, "Oh, he was an enemy of Israel. He was an anti-Semite." No, he wasn't an enemy of Israel. He wasn't an anti-Semite. I mean, not too many enemies of Israel go to pay a pilgrimage to Theodore Herzl's grave, but more moderate Jews would say, he disappointed us. He let us down, right? Because I mean, friends can let you down. Enemies don't let you down, right? So during this panel discussion, Rabbi David Sanmel, um, who's somebody I know really well, who's the current president of the International Conference of Christian and Jews. He was the head of IJKIC, and he's now like emeritus, but he was the head of interfaith relations for the ADL. And Rabbi Sandmel says, well, Pope Francis was from Latin America and he was influenced by liberation theology, which is not friendly to Israel. Um, Absolutely true that liberation theology is not friendly to Israel. How much the Pope was actually influenced by liberation theology, I'm not sure. I'm agnostic about that. But Rabbi Skorka, who knew him better, said that Pope Francis was primarily a pastor. He was primarily a pastor, and there are Palestinian Catholics, right? Moreover, there are Catholics in other Arab countries, right? So, as much as he desired positive relationship with Jews, he also desired, I mean, again, from his philosophy of the culture of dialogue, he wanted positive relationships with everybody. And he had a pastoral responsibility to, Palestinian Christians. Moreover, Rabbi Skorka said he was a spontaneous and a compassionate person, and he was not always careful about the political implications of his acts and of his words, right? But in terms of the pastoral, um, there is one Catholic church in Gaza, um, and I mean, these poor people, they are besieged from besieged from every side because Hamas is not exactly friendly towards Christians, but they're Palestinians living in Gaza, right? So they're not exactly, life is not good for them. And for as long as he could, the Pope called that church to speak to them every night, right? But that was a pastoral thing, right? And so here's what Rabbi Kronish says. All right, rather than taking one side in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Pope Francis reaffirmed his commitment to both the Jews and to all the people who inhabit the Holy Land, his way of referring to Palestinians. At the same time that the Pope was mindful of the attacks on Jews on October 7, 2023, and of increased anti Semitism in the world since then, he was also concerned about all of God's children, right? And I think we often tend to see the world in binaries, right? You're either pro Israel or you're pro Palestinian, right? And the Pope wanted to be both. And nobody wants you to be both. Pick a side, right? And it's the same thing. I mean, it's fascinating, and I would love to see him become the Pope. But one of the rumored candidates to be the new Pope, although there's a saying in Italian, whoever walks into the conclave as Pope walks out as a cardinal. But Cardinal Pizzaballa, who is the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. He's an Italian Franciscan priest, but he's lived in Jerusalem for 35 of his 60 years on earth. Fluent in Hebrew. I mean, I've seen speeches that he'd given in Hebrew, fluent, colloquial Hebrew, but he is, I mean, I can speak a lot about him. He was you probably are not aware that there is a job called the Vicar for the Hebrew speaking Catholic community of Israel. Right? You say Hebrew speaking Catholics, well, either Catholics married to Jews, Catholics with a Jewish grandparent who were able to make Aliyah under the law of return, etc. There are Hebrew speaking Catholics in Israel, and he was like in charge of them for a long time. He is the person who, fascinating, right? Translated the Mass into Hebrew. Um, but and he, I mean, was recent. He was made a cardinal a couple of years ago, and is considered to be one of the front runners. I mean, people figure if he can navigate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for 35 years and not have been killed by either side, maybe he could handle, larger assignment. But here's the thing. Many Israelis think he is too pro-Palestinian. Many Palestinians think he is too pro-Israeli. Okay, so like what else is new? Right? And I think the same thing that's said about Cardinal Pizzaballa was said about Pope Francis, right? That we maybe thought, well, he's okay, but he's too pro-Palestinian, and the Palestinians thought, he's too pro-Israeli. Okay, but so I want to wrap up at least what I want to say, and it's only 9:01, so I'm not doing too bad. So again, part of this panel discussion yesterday, one of the panelists was Professor Phil Cunningham from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, a long-standing Catholic expert on Catholic-Jewish relations, also somebody who I know quite well. And he picked up on Ambassador Evroni's statement. He said, look, you say that, prior to October 7th, it was a golden age of Catholic Jewish relations, and now maybe not so much. From the inception of the church to Nostra Aetate was 1,800 years, right? From Nostra Aetate to now, only 60 years, right? So, it's a little bit, I mean, he didn't use this phrase. I was going to say it's a little bit early to say Kaddish for for Christian Jewish relations, but Phil actually said, it's a little bit premature to declare the end of the golden age. There's been a lot of progress, but very often, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Because I mean, look, we may think Jews and Judaism is the only issue in the world, but that doesn't mean that everybody else thinks that, right? Particularly when there are, a few million Christians in the Arab world. So anyway, and it'll be interesting to see. I mean, because I mean, it's interesting. In the United States, vis-a-vis the Protestants, right? The liberal Protestants are much more favorable to Judaism as a religion, but not so much to Israel, right? The conservative Protestants are very pro-Israel, but they don't have a lot of use for Judaism. In the Catholic Church, like being favorable to Jews and Judaism is a liberalist progressive position. It's not, I mean, it's the traditionalist Catholics who feel, that the only true religion is Catholicism, right? So, I mean, I think that there are certain things that would be very hard to undo, but it will be interesting to see who the new pope is. And I almost said what he or she does, but I recognize I'm not speaking in the context of conservative Judaism. So let's say what he does and what direction he takes this relationship. Again, so 9:04, I finished what I wanted to say. Questions, comments? D, yeah.
This is a little bit aside, but it puts a little more context in what you said. I've heard different answers to this question, but what can you explain? The only word comes to mind is differences. I'm not looking for differences, but you mentioned Jesuit, and you mentioned was it Franciscan that you said?
Franciscans,
Okay.
right.
What, I mean, I know the literal. What is the difference, or what is the philosophy? How do you describe them?
Okay, so right, so there are different, there are a number of
Yeah,
different religious orders
right,
in the church, right? There are two kinds of priests. There's diocesan priests who like really, I mean, are independent. I mean, most priests in churches and whatever are diocesan
right,
priests, okay? And they receive a salary, they live on their own, they can retire, whatever. And then religious priests, meaning they belong to an order, like the Jesuits, the Franciscans, the Benedictines,
right,
the Trappists, the whatever. And each order has its own charism, like its own approach and its own like task. Okay. So that like the Franciscans, it's humility, it's poverty, it's outreach,
kindness,
particularly to the poor.
right,
Okay. But the Franciscans also, they have the custody of the Catholic holy sites in Israel, right? So if you go to Israel and you see the friars wearing the brown habits,
right,
those are Franciscans.
right,
Okay. And there's near Catholic universities, there's the Franciscan Monastery of the Holy Land, which is worth visiting if you haven't been. And they have like full scale replicas of a lot of the holy sites in Israel, because these are the same Franciscans who are in charge over in Israel. Okay, the Jesuits, and I mean, there's the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Jerusalem is run by the Jesuits, but the Jesuit focus is education in particular. Okay, and so a lot of the educational institutions of the Catholic Church are run by Jesuits, and that philosophy of dialogue, that's very Jesuit. I mean, my mentor, Father Walsh, taught us the exact same way, and subscribe to that same teaching. And when I had this delegation to Nogales, right, the organization that we worked with was also run by Jesuits, and it was that same sort of culture of encounter. So that's a particular sort of Jesuit way of being.
this is a kind of a pointed statement to make, and not that I believe it, I'm just trying to get a little more information. Um, could you say that the Jesuit, I would say, strictness is in any way equal to, or attention to ultra Orthodox or Haredi, any comparison at all?
I mean,
Not really.
it doesn't really track. I mean, they are, and so we'll wrap up with it. They are stricter in one sense, okay? In the sense that they have it takes longer to become a priest in the Jesuit order than in any other order. Okay. And you can't be, or like, I was 26 when I was ordained as a rabbi. You could not possibly be ordained as a priest in the Jesuit order at age 26, not until your early 30s. Okay. And they, most of them go on for PhDs, and have secular education. And they don't necessarily like work just in the church. Like Father Drinan was a congressman. He was a Jesuit. Daniel Berrigan was a radical communist. He was a Jesuit.
Right.
One of the great English poets, Gerard Manley Hopkins, was a Jesuit, etc. Okay. But that ultra, because they're not necessarily, I mean, doctrinally, they're mostly fairly liberal, actually. They're not, I mean, there are some who are not, but they are mostly fairly liberal in terms of like doctrine. Okay. I mean, it's no accident. I mean, like Georgetown, from its very founding, always accepted students of all religions, right? And again, no accident that Georgetown was the first Catholic university to have a full-time rabbi on the staff as a Jewish chaplain. So, that's not, to me, that's liberal. That's not traditional at all. All right. Thank you very much. Good night, folks.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
Happy to be of assistance.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks.